Putin says mission accomplished today on The World. I'm Carol Hills. Russia starts withdrawing its military from Syria. Putin calls the campaign a success, and many Russians agree.
I think there's a sense that, by and large, for Russia anyway, this was kind of a quick, short victory.
But will it make any difference in the talks aimed at ending the Syrian conflict?
Everybody's sticking to their talking points, even though they know that they're completely impossible to realize. Assad's going nowhere.
Plus, a Belgian playwright finds a wide audience.
For the non-Muslims, it was like if I opened the door for them. And for the Muslims, they feel like he's from us, and he's talking about us, and he says everything. And we were in need of that.
Those stories and the bookseller of Lucknow, ahead on The World. It's a big day here with key presidential primaries in Florida and Ohio. But in Moscow, it's mission accomplished. Okay, that's not exactly the language used by Russian President Vladimir Putin, but he did say Russia's military forces in Syria have achieved their goals and are coming home less than 6 months after the campaign began. Reporter Charles Maines is in Moscow. And Charles, many Russians must be relieved. There's been talk of a Syrian quagmire, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, even people who were not supporting this intervention in Syria have basically said that they welcome this news. I think there was a sense all along that there was a bit of exercise in the ghosts of Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a decade-long war that took thousands of lives. In this case, I think there's a sense that, by and large, for Russia anyway, this was kind of a quick, short victory. Russia's intervention was brief, but how much did it cost Russia in terms of blood and treasure? Well, it was a relatively expensive war, given the fact that, it's estimated basically $500 million for this campaign. Now, I suppose compared to the expenses that the U.S. military puts in putting its fighting force in place, it might sound fairly cheap. But you have to keep in mind that the Russian economy has been struggling lately, of course, under the weight of sanctions, Western sanctions, and as well the low price of oil globally. But in terms of human costs, in a way, I guess, from a military perspective, this was kind of a short, quick war. There were minimal loss of Russian soldiers. But on the other hand, you have the downing of the Metrojet airliner. This was over the Sinai Peninsula that took 220 lives. This was done by ISIS in revenge for the Russian intervention. So it's hard for me to imagine that those families look at this as such an easy war.
Why were Russian forces in Syria in the first place?
Well, the Kremlin's initial reason was essentially to take out Islamic State. They mentioned the fact that there were foreign fighters, basically Russian fighters, Russian citizens from the northern Caucasus who were in the battlefields of Syria, and that it was safer for the Russians to take on radical Islamic fighters in Syria rather than at home. But I think there was always a sense that there were several other reasons, perhaps more important. Certainly one was to secure their ally, Bashar al-Assad. Russian airstrikes essentially threw Assad a lifeline when he really needed it. But maybe more importantly, it reasserted Russia's role as kind of an essential player in international politics. If you think back to when this all began in late September, Russia was completely isolated over the annexation of Crimea and its intervention in Ukraine. And this essentially forced Western powers, and the U.S. in particular, to acknowledge that Russia was still a major player. And I think if you even look at the ceasefire that was negotiated in Syria, it was a U.S.-Russian-led ceasefire, which is awfully reminiscent of the old Soviet days when the U.S. and Russia could essentially throw their weight around and kind of carve up the globe.
But one of the things you mentioned as a reason for Russian forces going into Syria was getting rid of Islamic State. That certainly hasn't been accomplished. So what is the official reason given now for the pullout of Russian forces?
Well, his reasons were varied. He said that, look, that we've done a lot of damage against terrorists in Syria. The main part of our objectives have been achieved. I think there's no doubt, however, that the reason this is all timed to the peace talks that are now underway in Geneva at this moment, the Russians essentially have credited themselves with bombing Syria to the peace table, to the talks. And it's something that you see in state media and certainly in government circles, people crediting the Kremlin position on this.
Reporter Charles Maines in Moscow. Now to Joshua Landis, who directs the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. We talk to him frequently about Syria. Joshua, Putin says Russia has achieved what it wanted to in Syria. What's your take on that?
Well, he has in large extent. Assad is back in the driver's seat in Syria. His position has been much strengthened. The Russians changed the balance of power pretty dramatically in Syria. He has been taking town after town this last few months, and the rebels are in retreat. They're in chaos. They're fighting amongst themselves. So in that sense, Assad is here to stay, and Russia is not leaving. Let's remember, Putin has invested a great deal in Assad. He's not going to let that go down the drain. He's keeping forces.